The story begins with a team of explorers traveling across the South Atlantic Ocean. Among them was a weather officer named David, whose job was to monitor and report weather conditions. Their destination was a mysterious island located right in the middle of the ocean. The government had assigned David to spend an entire year there to collect weather data. Once he gathered a full year's worth of information, he was to return home. David was given enough food and supplies to last the whole year. After several days at sea, the team finally reached the island. Using a small boat, they landed on its deserted shores. The island was completely barren. Not a single bird or sign of life could be seen. On the island stood a lighthouse and a small house, where David was supposed to live. Previously, another weather officer named Robert had stayed there for a year, collecting data before his term ended. Now David was to replace him while Robert returned home with the ship. But when the team entered the house, they were shocked. There was no trace of Robert. His belongings were scattered everywhere, as if he had vanished suddenly. Captain and David decided to check the lighthouse, thinking Robert might be there. As they approached, they were startled to see the lighthouse surrounded by sharp wooden stakes, arranged as if to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in. They knocked on the gate several times, but no one answered. Finally, they forced the door open and went inside. There they met a man named Gruner. When they asked him about Robert, Gruner calmly said, "He's dead. He went to the sea one day and never came back." David and the captain were both stunned. Hearing this, the captain told David, "If you want, you can still come back with us." But David refused. He thought that if he successfully collected accurate weather data for the government, he could earn a big reward. The captain handed him a gun for protection and warned, "This place doesn't look safe. Take care of yourself." Then the ship departed, leaving David alone on the island for the year. David organized the house, making it livable. That night, while looking through a drawer, he found Robert's diary. It contained strange, fragmented notes about a mysterious creature on the island. Some pages had rough sketches of odd-looking beings. David couldn't understand why Robert would draw such things. Maybe he had done it out of loneliness. On one page was also a photo of Robert's wife. After reading for hours, David finally fell asleep. The next morning, David began his weather observations. But when he reached the shore, he noticed something odd: several stones and seashells arranged in strange patterns among the rocks. He assumed it must be Gruner's doing and returned to his work. Later, while looking through his binoculars toward the lighthouse, he thought he saw another figure standing next to Gruner. But when he blinked, it was gone. He tried looking again but saw nothing, thinking it must have been his imagination. That night, while David was busy writing notes, he heard a knock on the door. Thinking it might be Gruner, he called his name, but there was no response. Taking a lamp in his hand, he walked toward the door. Suddenly, strange, non-human sounds began echoing around him. Then, from under the door, he saw a horrifying hand, long, webbed, and nothing like a human's, trying to reach inside. Terrified, David ran to the basement and hid there. Moments later, the creature broke into the house. It searched frantically for him while David peeked through a small crack. But as he moved, the creature spotted him and lunged toward the opening. In panic, David grabbed a knife and stabbed its eye. The creature screamed and fled, but David knew it could return any time. By morning, he found footprints in the sand, large and strange, unlike any humans, leading back into the sea. Now he finally understood why Gruner had surrounded the lighthouse with sharp stakes. These creatures were real, and they were dangerous. Frightened, David ran to the lighthouse and shouted for Gruner to open the gate. But Gruner refused, yelling, "You should have left with the ship." He even poured water on David to force him away. Left with no choice, David fortified his house, boarding up windows, surrounding it with sharp stakes, and placing old papers and books near the entrance soaked in oil, planning to set them on fire if the creature returned. While searching the house, David found an old box containing a gun and several bullets. That gave him some hope. As night fell, he waited in silence, his heart pounding. Then he heard the sounds again. When he peeked outside, he was horrified to see dozens of those sea creatures emerging from the water, heading toward his house. They began breaking the door down. David fired repeatedly, killing some of them. But instead of fleeing, the others grew even more furious. Desperate, David set the papers on fire. The creatures shrieked in fear of the flames and retreated to the ocean, but the fire spread to the house. The wooden walls caught fire quickly. David wrapped himself in a blanket and escaped, hiding behind a large rock near the lighthouse. Rain began to pour heavily, slowly extinguishing the fire. But by morning, the house was completely destroyed. With no shelter left, David knew he had to find refuge in the lighthouse. He hid behind the rocks, waiting for Gruner to come out for water. When Gruner finally emerged, David followed him. But suddenly, one of the strange creatures attacked David. He managed to overpower it and was about to shoot when Gruner yelled, "Stop! That's my pet." David held his fire and instead made a deal. "If you want it to live, let me stay in the lighthouse." Gruner agreed, realizing David still had plenty of food and gunpowder. By evening, they both returned to the lighthouse and fell asleep. The next morning, David awoke to find the creature licking his injured hand, and to his astonishment, the wound had completely healed. David was amazed. He wanted to learn more about these beings and maybe share their existence with the world. It would make him and Gruner famous and rich. But Gruner wasn't interested. He didn't want to leave the island. With no one left in the world, the island had become his kingdom. He even carved messages around the island saying, "Gruner is the king here." David then asked how the creature became his companion. Gruner explained that long ago he had saved it after it got caught in his fishing net. It was small back then and stayed with him ever since, obeying his every command. But Gruner was cruel. He abused the creature physically every day. Once it attacked him, and in revenge, he punished it so severely that it became completely submissive. Now David realized why the other creatures attacked the island every night. They were trying to rescue this female creature from Gruner. But they could not come during the day because sunlight burned their skin. David wanted to leave the island now more than ever. But Gruner warned him, "Get your gun ready. They might attack again tonight." When darkness fell, the creatures emerged from the sea in large numbers, heading toward the lighthouse. Gruner kept firing at them while David, terrified, hid inside despite Gruner's orders to fight. Eventually, David fainted from fear. Gruner fought them alone all night. The next morning, Gruner, angry, threw water on David to wake him up and said, "If you want to live, you'll have to fight. Otherwise, I'll throw you out. You'll obey my orders. Fetch water, do lighthouse chores, and stand guard with me at night." David had no choice. He began following Gruner's commands. But what disturbed him most was how cruelly Gruner continued to treat the female creature. One night, during guard duty, the sea creatures attacked again. This time, David didn't hesitate. He fought bravely while Gruner locked him outside, forcing him to learn how to survive on his own. By dawn, David was covered in blood but alive. He had learned how to fight them. Days turned into weeks. David lived like a prisoner, fighting the creatures at night and serving Gruner by day. The island became his prison. Yet, over time, he grew closer to the female creature, whom he named Aneris. He began to feel sympathy for her. She, too, was lonely, separated from her people, just like him. As time passed, the attacks slowly decreased. David thought maybe the creatures had given up or moved elsewhere for the winter. But Gruner warned, "No, they're multiplying. They'll return stronger." One night after dinner, the two played chess to pass the time. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot to turn on the lighthouse light. Taking advantage of the darkness, the creatures launched a massive attack. When David looked outside, he saw hundreds of them approaching. They could no longer fight, and this time they had no plan at all. The bullets for their guns were almost completely gone. Somehow, dodging and defending themselves, they managed to reach the top of the lighthouse. But during the struggle, Gruner suffered a deep injury in his leg. That night, the creatures had clearly overpowered them. Both men thought their deaths were certain. But luckily, dawn arrived. As the sun slowly rose, the creatures retreated into the sea. When the blazing sunlight spread across the island, Aneris tried to heal Gruner's wound. By now, David had realized that they could never win this war against the creatures. Their bullets were almost gone, and their food supplies were running out fast. The next day, while wandering outside the lighthouse, David spotted a ship far away in the ocean. He rushed inside, grabbed the flare gun, and prepared to signal the ship for rescue. But Gruner stopped him. He didn't want David to leave. At that very moment, Aneris attacked Gruner, trying to protect David from him. Gruner, however, refused to let anyone leave the island. This island was his world, his kingdom, and he saw himself as its ruler. He didn't want David to escape either, because after so long in isolation, Gruner finally had someone to talk to. If David left on that ship, he would reveal everything to the world about Aneris and the creatures. So Gruner decided David could never leave. Slowly, the ship disappeared into the ocean before David's eyes. He felt hopeless. Days passed like this. Gruner continued to treat both David and Aneris cruelly, but he was especially violent toward Aneris, something David deeply despised. One day, David gifted Aneris a small toy boat he had crafted from fish bones. When Aneris saw the boat, she took David to a hidden corner of the island, where a real boat was kept. When David asked Gruner about it, Gruner admitted he already knew. He explained that long ago, some people had reached this island in that boat while trying to save their lives. But before morning came, all of them were killed by the creatures. They had been transporting ammunition on their ship, but a storm had sunk it near the island. Hearing this, David got an idea. They had an old diving suit, and David suggested that one of them could use it to dive down to the sunken ship. There, they might find bullets or dynamite, anything that could help them fight the creatures. Gruner refused at first, but David was willing to risk his life to try. Days went by, and David's bond with Aneris grew deeper. He began to care for her. Their closeness turned into romance, and Gruner secretly saw them together. He became jealous, thinking Aneris was taking David's side, that she would steal David away from him. So he decided David had to die. The next day, Gruner pretended to agree with David's plan. He said, "All right, you'll wear the diving suit, go down there and collect all the RDX, explosives. Once you've done that, I'll pull you back up." But Gruner had other intentions. He wanted David to retrieve the dynamite boxes for him, and then leave him underwater to die, so the creatures could finish him off. That way, Gruner would get the explosives and regain control over Aneris. They rowed to the site where the ship had sunk. David put on the diving suit and descended into the ocean. Below, he saw the ship's wreckage, completely destroyed. But he was lucky. He found a few boxes of dynamite. Just then, several creatures appeared before him. David panicked and fell to the seafloor. The heavy suit pinned him down, and he couldn't move. He also couldn't signal Gruner for help. Gruner assumed the creatures had killed David, but in reality, the ones David saw were just two young creature children. Somehow, David managed to remove the heavy suit, swim to the surface, and return with some old boxes full of dynamite. Together, David and Gruner began working. They placed 2 layers of dynamite around the lighthouse, hoping to destroy the monsters completely during their next attack. Months passed, and winter arrived. Suddenly, the creatures stopped attacking. It was as if they knew a trap had been set. Gruner grew suspicious. He thought Aneris had warned them. Furious, he began abusing her again, but David intervened and stopped him. Eventually, they came up with a new plan. They would leave the main lighthouse gate wide open. When the creatures entered, they would detonate the dynamite and blow them all up. Acting cleverly, David asked Aneris to scream from the top of the lighthouse to lure the creatures. As soon as they heard her cry, the creatures became enraged. Seeing the open gate, they thought this was their chance to rescue Aneris, but it was all a trap. Soon, the creatures emerged from the ocean, rushing straight toward the gate. They attacked David, but he managed to escape and fight back. As the creatures reached the lighthouse walls, Gruner pulled the detonator lever, but nothing happened. The explosion didn't go off. David quickly realized Gruner had forgotten to reconnect the wires after David had disconnected them earlier. He sprinted upstairs and reattached the connection. Meanwhile, the creatures began climbing the lighthouse, and Gruner struggled to hold them off alone. As soon as the circuit was complete, David triggered the first explosion. A massive blast wiped out many of the creatures, but dozens more kept coming. So Gruner activated the second layer of dynamite. The second explosion was even stronger. Both men were knocked unconscious by the shockwave. When they woke up the next morning, Aneris was gone. Dead creatures were scattered everywhere. Gruner was finishing off the few survivors. Then David noticed one dying creature wearing a necklace. Seeing it suffer, David felt pity and guilt. For the first time, he realized that these creatures were not monsters. They were living beings, just like humans. They simply couldn't speak. But to Gruner, this compassion meant nothing. After that night, the creatures never attacked again. Yet every day, David could hear sorrowful cries coming from the sea. He finally understood the magnitude of what they had done. How many families had been destroyed. How many children had lost their loved ones, all because of a misunderstanding. The next day, David saw a few young creature children playing near the shore, orphans who had lost their families. Moved by guilt, he built a circle of stones and placed the toy boat in the center, hoping Aneris would see it and return. He waited for hours, but she never came. The next morning, David woke up and saw Gruner sleeping nearby. Close to him were some old belongings, including a photograph. When David looked closely, he was shocked. It was the same woman whose picture he had seen in Robert's old diary. Standing beside her in the photo was Gruner himself. That's when David realized the truth. The previous weather officer, Robert, had never died. He had simply changed his identity. Gruner was Robert all along. He had taken a new name because he never wanted to leave the island again. Seeing this, David gave up hope of ever escaping. The next evening, while walking along the shore, he noticed that the toy boat inside the stone circle was gone. In its place stood a young creature child holding the boat. David threw a burning stick into the center of the circle, a gesture to show that he meant no harm, that he wanted peace. Moments later, Aneris emerged from the waves, followed by her entire group of sea creatures. But this time, none of them attacked. They wanted peace, too. They only wanted a safe home for their children. Just then, Gruner appeared, holding a gun. He couldn't tolerate peace. To him, peace meant losing his power. David tried to calm him down, saying, "They don't want to fight, Gruner. They want peace." But Gruner didn't listen. He shouted at Aneris, "Get inside!" For the first time, Aneris refused to obey. She was no longer his slave. Seeing this, Gruner realized he had lost his rule, his control. Enraged and broken, he stormed toward the lighthouse. David thought Gruner had finally understood that every living being deserves freedom, that no one should live as a prisoner. But Gruner's obsession with dominance wasn't over. When he reached the lighthouse, he fired a flare gun, and the flare struck one of the creature children, killing it instantly. Terrified, the other creatures fled, and even Aneris lost faith in David. Overcome with rage, David ran to the lighthouse to confront Gruner. "Why did you do this?" he shouted. "They only wanted peace." But Gruner, consumed by madness, grabbed an iron rod and tried to attack David. Just then, David called out his real name. "Stop, Robert! You're not a killer!" Hearing that name stopped Gruner in his tracks. In truth, Robert had never been a violent man. Years of isolation, his wife's death, and deep depression had shattered his mind. He wasn't evil, just broken. Finally realizing the truth, Gruner understood that the creatures had never wanted war. They only wanted to live in peace. Filled with regret, he walked outside and surrendered himself to the creatures. Within moments, they killed him. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time passed. A year later, a government ship arrived at the island with a new weather officer. The captain asked David about the previous officer. David gave the same answer Robert once gave. He went toward the sea and never came back. The new officer assumed that David was Gruner. David didn't correct him. He silently walked out to the balcony and stood there, because now he too didn't want to leave the island, just like Gruner before him. Meanwhile, Aneris lived happily with her family. There was no Gruner to fear anymore. They were finally free, both in the sea and on the island. And with that, the story ends.